Hello and welcome everyone. We are stoked to have you all. I will give you all a minute while we wait for everyone to get situated and dialed in. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll because we're curious to see what's bringing you to today's webinar. Is it educational? Are you in the beginning stages of your third-party risk management program? A current prevalent customer? Do you just want to hear our voices? Either way, let us know. And I can't forget about some introductions. My name is Ashley. I work in business development here at Prevalent, and we are joined with two very special guests, Thomas Humphreys, our content manager. Hey, Thomas.
Hey, Ashley. Hey, everyone.
And Joe Toley, our project manager. Hey, Joe.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're well.
And I also can't forget about our very own VP of Product Marketing, Scott Lang. Hey, Scott.
Hey, Ashley. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. And just a quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded and we will be sending out the recording along with the presentation slides shortly after this webinar. You're all currently muted, but we do love participation. So please put any questions in our Q&A box so we can go over them at the end of the webinar. So today, Thomas and Joe will be discussing the pros and cons of using the NIST framework. So gentlemen, I'll toss the keys over to you and let you start driving.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ashley. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Is the presentation visible?
Visible, Mark. Thanks, Tom.
Yep. Fantastic. Okay. Yes. Very good. Warm welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone on the call. My name is Thomas Humphreys. As Ashley mentioned, I am the content manager at Prevalent, and with me, I'm pleased to have Mr. Joe Toley, the project director at Prevalent as well. We've covered the key, obviously, housekeeping aspects of today. As already alluded to, we do have an open chat window and a Q&A. Feel free to use the Q&A throughout today's presentation. We always try to leave some time at the end to answer many questions, but certainly if there are any pertinent questions coming up relevant to the areas and the slides that we are on and the topics that we're discussing, we may pull up a few of the questions at that time as well. Just a very brief introduction to myself. So I head up content development within Prevalent. So building frameworks based on known standards, local and international standards, areas such as NIST and ISO. I used to be an ISO auditor for the best part of 10 years, working very closely with many companies across the UK, Singapore, Europe, and America as well. And I'll briefly hand over to Joe.
Thanks, Tom. And hi, everyone. Pleasure to meet you all on the call today. I'm Joe Toley, the project director at Prevalent. I spent a lot of time working with clients in building out programs and hoping them to get their programs set up correctly to assess third parties in an efficient way. So process is something I'm very keen on, gaining efficiencies. As we all know, the more inefficiencies we have as we assess vendors, the more it sort of multiplies across the program. So here today to feed off of Thomas's technical knowledge on NIST and see how we can leverage it to get the best out of a program.
Fantastic, thank you. And with that, we can make a start. So what's on the agenda today? So the overarching topic is around understanding NIST and the pros and cons of the framework. We'll start with getting to know the NIST standards, having a wider overview of what NIST is, what it does as an organization, and then focusing very much on a lot of the security and cybersecurity based frameworks. Before doing a deeper dive in terms of the positives and some of the negatives as well as of the frameworks, and what it means in terms of developing and continuing your third-party risk management program. We'll then shift gear and looking at how you can adopt the NIST framework and putting a few of the standards to help, whether it's building the framework for the first time, your TPRM, or enhancing and adapting it for those who already have an existing program in place. And then we'll spend a bit of time looking at breaking down specifically the NIST 853 controls and understanding how we can start to piece together what controls best fit our programs and how we can use that alongside managing and understanding our third parties. So, if it's take a wider overview first, as we see across many industries now, both locally and internationally, there's a huge increase in the volume of third parties, the type of third parties that organizations are dealing with. There seems to be an ever expanding network of organizations, suppliers, partners, getting involved in many aspects of the day-to-day running of an organization. Many of this is coming from increase in the use of service offerings, the use of digital transformation, and some of these topics that have been around for a few years, however, but are still increasing. And of course, what we're seeing now, of course, is that this increase in suppliers and the wider supply chain is having a wider impact on those critical systems, components, products, and services as well. And naturally, as you'd expect, as the supply chain grows, having a wider global impact, a global distribution of where we're getting products and services from, where we're getting components from. So the concept of the fourth and nth party or wider supply chain keeps on increasing. Very relevant for many organizations, but of course, all it does mean is that we need to have stronger control, stronger governance. Now more than ever, there needs to be more focus in terms of how we manage and understand these third parties and how we can assess them, review them, engage with them, respond to them, and monitor them based on the product and service and systems that they're providing to us. So with an ever-expanding network of suppliers in the wider supply chain, more than ever, there needs to be a greater control and governance and oversight in terms of this wider network.
Yeah, and Tom, are you finding that the number of, the frequency of updates to these types of contents and frameworks changes more frequently than it used to with these increased systems and mechanisms?
That's a very good question. Now, as we'll see, particularly with NIST, many of the what you might call established frameworks and established standards do have a structured approach when they update themselves and go through a formal review process to take in more topics, new and emerging trends based on different threats and events out there in the world. But one thing that we are seeing is expansion of new standards from bodies such as NIST, such as ISO, whether they're responding to sector-specific calls and sector-specific concerns. For example, in the financial sector, we're finding more financial bodies and regulators impressing the need for supply chain management, cybersecurity management, for example. So yes, we are seeing many standards going through the regular update on an annual, every 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We are seeing a significant uptake in new standards and new frameworks or guidelines addressing some of these concerns, which you'd expect. But I think it just very much reflects the nature of how ingrained and how critical this subject area is at this point in time.
That's great. Thanks, Tom.
So let's have a look in a bit more detail around NIST. So NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, it's a US organization, and it's one of its main focuses is on the promotion of standards across science, across technology, across multiple different disciplines as well. One area that we are focusing on today is very much around information and cybersecurity and the risk that sits around that. But there are many other standards that NIST as an organization promotes across multiple industries and sectors. As an organization, many of these standards were initially developed for federal government and government-based institutions, agencies and contractors. And you can see that through some of the technicality that some of these standards bring and some of the technical requirements and expectation they bring with it. But nevertheless, what we're finding now is many of the frameworks, such as 853, perhaps one of the more well-known standards in NIST, is becoming adopted more globally, both by government-based organizations and government-based contractors and non-government organizations and institutions, whether it's from the US or outside as well. So we're seeing a wider adoption and intake, which sort of recognizes these best practices and where NIST has taken these frameworks.
Yeah. And Tom, out of curiosity, we have NIST, we have the likes of ISO 27001 and SIG, lots of different frameworks and standards out there. Is there a reason why, apart from the ones that are focused on US federal government agencies and contractors, is there another reason why other organizations might pick NIST over one of those other standards and frameworks?
Yes, it's a very good question. Good point. There's a lot of standards and frameworks out there. Perhaps one of the most well known is, let's take ISO 27001. One of the biggest drivers we're finding companies choosing the NIST 800 standard or series of standards is because, one, it's free. It's a freely available framework that can be accessed by anyone. There is a wider global recognition of the framework as well, not just, again, those organizations who are tied to government institutions, but elsewhere and outside, we're finding more companies recognizing the benefits and some of the best practices that come from these technical control standards. Another key factor, of course, is there is a close relationship, again, as we'll see later on today, between NIST and some of these other standards, such as ISO and SIG. So there's a close relationship and commonality between some of the controls, which, of course, can make it easier for some companies if they start on the path of cybersecurity with NIST, but with the long-term aim to go through certifications such as ISO as well.
Okay, so they could start off with a process of aligning to NIST internally as their sort of local standard framework that they pick, and then through aligning, developing controls and mapping to the control requirements of NIST, it increases it simplifies that transition period later on where they might seek to get an ISO.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And we'll see that later on today through some of that commonality of controls and control points as well.
Yeah, and does NIST keep up to date with, as you mentioned earlier, about the growing need for privacy and security concerns around data? Does NIST keep in line with those requirements because it has this need to support US federal government agencies and that aspect?
Yes, it does. So in a not too dissimilar method or approach to other organizations like ISO or the IEC, and other standards bodies, it does have a structured process of updating or regularly updating its frameworks, primarily, yes, to address those concerns. So where there are new and emerging threats, where there's, say, a greater increase in data privacy, for example, or supply chain, these are areas where at a point in time they'll decide to expand its standard, and in some cases develop new standards as well, if the subject area warrants a new standard or a new framework.
Yeah, sounds great. Freely available, updated in line with with recognized sensitive areas, and it's something that we can easily convert to ISO 27001 later on. So it sounds like a good path to go down for someone that probably hasn't embarked yet on a cybersecurity program or building their own internal policies and procedures.
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of it's an attractive route to go down if you're just starting out in the cybersecurity space or wanting to explore that area, both for yourself as a business, but also when dealing with suppliers and the wider supply chain as well.
Sounds great.
And it's important to note, as you can see on the right hand side. So although we are focusing on 853. It isn't the only standard out there that touches on risk management, and cybersecurity. And again, in a similar vein to other standards bodies, NIST does develop what I like to call a family of standards. That is to say, a series of standards, a series of guidelines that either complement each other or enhance each other. And it's always worth noting on these wider range of standards, because although there may be one that focuses on controls and control development or control requirements, there'll be others that help complement that and to make for a more meaningful framework.
Great.
So NIST standards can overlap and they can complement each other. And here's a few key areas to focus on. So 853 down the bottom there, the security and privacy controls for information systems and organizations. SIS is perhaps the more widely used and widely known framework, and it's this standard, this framework that we're seeing being used to assess the wider third party and the wider supply chain. However, as you can see, sitting around that is a series of other standards, CSF, Cybersecurity Framework, which takes aspects of 853 but puts them in a clearly defined structure. And we'll see later on today how we can use the CSF when we're trying to work out how do we organize our controls, how do we determine controls based on our scenarios. Series of standards focusing on risk management, so developing a clear risk management structure, risk management framework, not too dissimilar to other frameworks such as ISO 30,000 on risk management. And as you can see down the bottom there, there's a supply chain specific framework that takes controls from 853 and enhances them, but also sets a scene for a more structured approach of, from the ground up, how do you build a third-party risk management or supply chain risk management process? So from third-party engagement to setting management policy, risk, and the full wraparound that a true TPRM or SCRM will give you. So we can see quite a few different standards and frameworks that can be used, if in the right way, to help complement and some build and strengthen your TPRM.
And when we're looking here at NIST, and we can see those families that overlap with the ISO standards and frameworks, is there any reason why you would, why you might pick ISO 27001, for example, over the NIST route? Obviously, we've covered off sort of some of the pros there of NIST, but how about the other way around?
Yes, it's always an interesting debate which one to go for. Is one better than the other? Is ISO better than NIST and vice versa, or is ISO better than SIG? Each one has its own merits. One of the biggest drivers with ISO, of course, is it's a certifiable standard. Although there's necessary costs associated around that whole process that we won't go into. Obviously, one of the biggest drivers around companies going through ISO is it provides an independent oversight and recognition of an organization's security posture that you won't get through the NIST standard. So that's one route, or one example of why ISO may be chosen over NIST. Another one is the way the controls are developed. As we'll see shortly, NIST has a lot of complexity around many of the controls that ISO doesn't go into. There's a lot of commonality, as I said at the start, but there is a lot of areas that NIST expands on in a very technical way. And so in many industries, in many sectors, ISO is still seen as a front runner in terms of recognized frameworks. But as I say, each one has its own pros and cons, as we'll see shortly.
Yes, it sounds like NIST would give you the self-confidence that you've aligned to a reliable framework that's really detailed and covers pretty much what ISO 27001 does, but it just doesn't give you that stamp of approval that you could share or get recognized for from the rest of the industry. Okay.
Absolutely.
Brilliant.
Okay, and consistent terminology, practices, and control structure throughout. Again, it's always worth noting. It can always be a bit mind-boggling at first when you're presented with multiple standards and frameworks. And one of the first things that can be mind-boggling is just the type of terminology. But there is a consistency that obviously NIST brings across its wider, as say, family of standards and frameworks.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, Tom, just to cover that one off. So if we are leveraging the NIST framework over ISO 27001, should we expect that if we're engaging suppliers and assessing particular control requirements, for example, that there may be some impact from the supplier not recognizing control references or some of the terminology used and that kind of detail?
In some cases, yes. Now, one of the benefits I've seen is quite evident when you're looking at those two particular. I know we keep touching on ISO, but I think it's quite relevant given the relative close relationship between the two frameworks in terms of what they set out to do and the terminology particularly. It's the terminology is always can be a potential minefield, particularly for companies not used to it for the first time and having to explain, well, we've viewed it from this angle before, we're now going into this different angle. Is it the same subject? Is it the same meaning? Does it have the same weight towards it? But there is a lot of even in many of the terms, the way NIST, for example, describes access and the concept of access management and access control versus the way ISO describes it as well. And that's a huge help as well, particularly looking at it from the other side of those organizations who may be certified to ISO, let's turn it around, but they want to use NIST to expand and mature their framework and mature their management system. So there's just getting to understand some of these terms and control structures can help greatly in terms of sort of taking you to that next level in terms of management system. So let's take a step into 853 now. So it's certainly become the most widely used of the NIST standards on some risk and security, cyber security. So how big is it? So on the right-hand side, there are 20 controls or control groups, to be more specific. And across those 20 control groups, there are over 950 individual controls. Okay. To put that into perspective, 27001 has around 113 controls in the old 2013 standard. I think it's about 96 in the new 2022 standard. Some of the SIG frameworks have around 150 to 200 in the newer versions. So you can see there's a lot of controls split across these 20 control groups, quite significant.
Yeah, and I have a feeling we're not going to cover off each control today, Tom, on this webinar.
I'm afraid not, no. But hopefully it will give an idea of the depth of some of these areas. So obviously, what does this give? As you'd expect with the volume, the potential for a very in-depth assessment across every control group. Kept on using the term commonality, and some of it is quite evident and obvious when you go through the control groups. So access control, we're looking at user registration and deregistration, privileged access, multi-factor authentication, and access reviews and so on and so forth, instant response to full management and end-to-end process of handling an incident. But it's when you get to some of the other areas that become quite technical and looking at very specific aspects. So the use of architecture for managing address resolution, for example, deploying decoy controls to become targets for certain attacks, for example, and the way that application management and application development has expanded to look at a greater focus around developer training and developer focused training, for example. So there's many areas that NIST touch on, but they go that extra level, which of course allows for reviews at a much more granular level. And as mentioned at the start of the topic, I believe a lot of this was driven based on where 853 came from, its need to focus on requirements for federal agencies, for critical national infrastructure based organizations and agencies and groups. And so there's a need to have that very technical scope.
Yeah.
During
that comparison with ISO 27001 again, or even some of the other frameworks as well, I've noticed they're not your sort of traditional domains that you see across other standards. Are these additional areas of controls, or is it just a different angle of how those controls are mapped to these areas?
It's a bit of both. Some of it comes down to the terminology that NIST has used and used historically. Other than this, it's simply a what's the best word? Almost a rebalancing of where they've positioned controls in certain areas, or where they put controls that sit across multiple control groups, but all relate to a similar topic area.
Okay, so it's more the sort of depth of control assessment rather than differences in controls altogether.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Great stuff. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so what I'm seeing so far, what I'm hearing, sorry, is NIST seems to be great at detailing all of the controls you could possibly ever want, especially to the level of government agencies, for example. But when it comes to supplier assessments, this might not be the best approach to just take that copy of controls and ask your supplier to assess against those, for example. There's probably going to be far too many to make this an efficient process. And I could also see challenges in taking that vast number of controls and actually focusing those down to something meaningful to assess a supplier against. There's going to be some noise there. You're going to worry about which controls to select to carry forward and which ones not to. Obviously, you mentioned a few controls there before, which sounded quite detailed and something you wouldn't go and ask a supplier about. So it's going to be difficult to try and apply that filter and know what to address with your supplier and what not to. And then we touched on as well the terminology that's used within NIST, and I just see a note in the comments about the control mapping that is provided between NIST and ISO. I think that although it's great to have that mapping, if we approach a supplier and ask them to reference a particular NIST control reference and give us some validation on whether it's in place, it's going to take them longer to get those responses back to us and understand exactly how they should be answering a question, because it might not be something they're particularly used to responding to and have the expertise to respond to as well. So there, as well as it being very great at some things, I can also see there are going to be some negatives to do with the process side of using NIST to assess suppliers. Tom, if you're able to hop onto the next slide for us, I think we can cover off some of the impacts that these negative points might have. Process, the bit that I love to talk about. The fact that we are, well, the idea of assessing a supplier against lots and lots of controls, it's obviously going to take longer. So we would want to avoid making that process take longer because it's going to cost a lot more resource internally to actually manage an assessment. So as I said a moment ago, it's going to be quite valuable in performing an exercise to actually trim those number of controls we care about down to something that's meaningful. Obviously, the longer a process takes, the more it costs internally. And if we are delving into some of the detail of some of those more unknown controls that you quoted earlier, it's going to take more expertise as well to actually look at them, review them, understand them, and know how to respond to them if there's a finding against some of those technicals as well. One thing that I find is quite common with supplier assessments is generating too much noise. You know, we ask a lot of questions about controls. Sometimes those results come back and they're not that much of a concern to the supplier, either because the supplier maybe doesn't handle data on behalf of you, but we're asking them data related questions. You know, those types of scenarios where what we're asking doesn't quite align to the service. So the more we do that, the more noise we're going to get generated. So I think there's certainly going to be some value in tuning this process down again to something more meaningful, where every time we get a finding or we get a particular risk generated through the process, it's something actionable, something meaningful, and something that if we report on is going to be valuable to the organization as well.
And I guess, Joe, on that point, I mean, certainly, yes, we've just seen that there's upwards of 900 or so, almost veering on 1,000 separate controls. And I guess that's a challenge, isn't it? That knowing as the end user, when we're building our framework, when we're building our survey, what are the right controls that we really need to focus on based on ourselves as a business and our own risk appetite. And
it's nice to know that if you are working with NIST, there is this, you've got a portfolio of all the controls that are going to be valuable. So
yes.
you're not going to have to rebuild any of this or select new standards to incorporate or frameworks to incorporate. It's just going to be an adaptation of those NIST controls that we're assessing against, just to find out where that sort of sweet spot is of getting valuable information. And there is a point on the right there, all on its own, which I actually think is really important here. To get valuable information from our suppliers, actionable items, we want a good level of engagement from suppliers. We want to be able to perform an assessment, have willing participation from the supplier. You're probably not going to get that if you do assess against 950 controls. So the more we can make this process as sort of slick as possible, the more the likelihood increases of actually getting valuable data back, having things turned around in shorter amounts of time, and obviously encouraging collaboration with our suppliers as well, which I think is hugely important in having a relationship that progresses over time.
Absolutely.
So
and I guess,
go ahead, Tom.
Yes, and I guess, of course, Joe, I guess looking at these, you could definitely see why these could, I guess, put someone off from this, saying it's just far too much, it's far too detailed, it's far too complex. And certainly, like you say, if we're lacking the expertise and the knowledge, or we'll end up upsetting our vendors, saying fill out 1,000 question assessment for us. So I guess the ultimate question then is, well, how can an organization take this and take something like NIST and then turn it around to make it a more targeted, more relevant framework for that business?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of options here. We can obviously work with NIST as a whole and tune it down based on our risk appetite internally. What do we care about? What do we care about for our suppliers? What do we expect them to have in place when we deliver certain services? Another approach that could be really beneficial here is actually not reinventing the wheel, but leveraging some of the experience of other standards and frameworks. So we know here that NIST has more controls than ISO 27001, or I think from the SIG's perspective as well. We could actually use a bit of a hybrid approach of mapping to ISO 27001 or another recognized standard, and actually leveraging what they think is important as well, so that we sort of trim down NIST into something that is a bit more of a hybrid and a collaborative bit of content that we know would be recognized if someone did recognize the ISO 27001 standard or did leverage SIG internally, for example.
Yeah, so really using the best of both worlds or multiple worlds to say we can demonstrate best practice, but it could perhaps be more advantageous to the wider sort of stakeholder groups and other interested parties as well.
Exactly.
And I guess a lot of this starts from taking a step back and really working out, what are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to get out of this? And what are our objectives when developing a TPRM and using the likes of NIST? And certainly at the top level, it's all about establishing those best practices, establishing what are we trying to achieve from the outset when we think about our vendors, the type of companies that we're engaging with, the type of product and service they're supplying, or the sectors they're in, or even the geographies they're in. All of these can impact what type of controls we're using or should be using. And on top of that, looking at, well, how can we use them to gain that assurance from a third party that they have a good security posture, a good privacy or cybersecurity posture, whatever the topics are. So having a very clear baseline first of working out where we want to be, and then following that through with, are we going to get the return from that investment from these third parties, from these vendors that we're working with?
Yeah, completely agree.
And of course, to your point earlier, Joe, as well, of course, that continual positive relationship that we should get from these organizations that we engage with, both in the short and long term.
Yep.
So, having a look at those objectives and understanding that we need to set the scene, we need to have good relationships with our organizations, with our vendors and partners. Well, how can we determine that success when we're building or when we're enhancing or updating our risk framework? So establishing that best practice, as I've mentioned, those most appropriate controls that are relevant to supplier services. Each supplier is very different. Each supplier, whether it's the size of the supplier, the complexity, the type of service they're delivering, they may not all warrant the same volume and same type of controls. And so making sure that content is the most relevant, is going to give us the most value and return. Once we've set the scene in terms of identifying those controls, we know what we want to achieve, we know the control groups from NIST that are important to us as a business or important to the industry, we can then start to go down further and look at the efficiencies around, well, what are those critical control areas, what are the risk areas that are most concerning to us, because those are the ones that we need to focus on. Once we have those assessments, we conduct those surveys, those audits on the vendors. When risks start coming back, or we have areas and gaps that we need to focus on, do we know what we need to focus on? Have we identified what those critical areas are, so that we can be efficient with our time?
Yeah, and I guess that works both ways, doesn't it, Tom? Because you've got the recipient of an assessment that might be, well, having to fill out questions or give you information about controls that might not be relevant. But then you've also got the other side of this where you actually have to review these controls as well. So you get sort of noises on both sides. So yeah, the more efficiency we can gain through that process, the less time is wasted on both sides, which is always a good thing.
Absolutely. In terms of the third objective, Joe, I mean, what sort of tips would you generally say? What's I guess a typical approach to making sure that, okay, we're sending out this assessment to this vendor or series of vendors. How do we make sure that they're actually going to be engaged and going to give us that level of assurance?
Yeah, I think those first 2 points are going to be hugely beneficial. From our portfolio of controls, we're selecting only the ones that are meaningful and giving us value. I think that's going to be the sort of number one priority to gain efficiency there. And obviously, the more efficiency we have, the more engagement we have as well. The other aspect to this is making sure the process of assessment is going to be something that's user-friendly as well. We want to make sure it's a simple process for a vendor to give us this information, which I guess is also why, having these mappings to other recognized standards that the vendor might be using may speed up the process of giving us information, why that might be valuable. Obviously, using a form of automated platform is always going to be beneficial. We want to make sure we are collecting as much of this important information with the fewest interactions with a supplier. It shouldn't be a process where we're reaching out, asking a question. They may respond to it, and suddenly we have a finding that we need to review. And because of that, there's several other follow-up questions, and that process is multiplied by the amount of controls that we're assessing against. So one thing I'd always recommend is collecting as much of that important information as possible within our first interaction. With our assessment content, as you're well aware, Tom, when we build out our series of questions, if we identify a finding, there may be some follow-up questions already embedded in our process. So we're still getting that information we need through the supplier assessment. So yeah, I would say making sure we're using the right content to assess efficiently, and then making that collection process and that engagement process with the vendor as slick as possible, so that we get all the information we need, so that we can make some informed decisions on how to manage that particular vendor.
And of course, one area that's always worth highlighting for any part of the TPRM journey is this idea of continual monitoring, continual review, because obviously businesses change, vendors, partners change, as do the standards, as we discussed earlier. And when new and emerging threats occur, and frameworks are updated, or where businesses expand and take on new work or new systems and new processes, it means there will naturally be changes in the type of questions we want to ask, or risks that could occur or potentially could occur as well. And so having that continual engagement and continual monitoring to make sure vendors remain accurate, or the profiles that we have on them remain accurate, is very critical as well, if we want to get the best out of the process. I mentioned at the start of the discussion that there are a series of frameworks, and although we'll be focusing more on 853, there are other standards that the NIST has developed. One of them is CSF, or the Cybersecurity Framework. And I thought this is a good juncture just to show and highlight how, particularly when you're looking at standards and you're trying to work out which controls are best for us, one of the daunting tasks is focusing too much on the volume. So what CSF does is it takes the NIST controls and it breaks them down into these 5 areas. What they call identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And so under each of these particular topics or subject headings, you start to break down the type of controls. So why is this important? So when you look at risk management and you look at assessing the risks or potential risks to your vendors, you'll naturally come up with more critical risk areas than others. And to deal with these risks and to address these risks, you'll naturally need some controls over others. There'll be more technical or operational, organizational controls. There'll be more controls focusing on how a business responds, how it can recover from an event, such as continuity and availability, for example, or controls for focusing on how a business may protect data and the necessary data security controls around it. And so the CSF helps to break up and to put these controls into respective buckets. So protection-based controls focusing on limiting, containing threat, to respond and recovery-based controls, so restoring a capability or a service. And so obviously this can help when you're trying to work out, well, based on what these vendors do, what type of control should we be focusing on. And so this gives you an indication and an insight into how you can take the controls from 853, but then use other areas of the NIST standards to help embellish or enhance the understanding of what controls are relevant.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So is this an approach that's unique to the NIST framework, or do other standards that you've come across incorporate this type of approach?
So interestingly, we were talking about ISO, we were making comparisons with ISO. Their brand new the update to their standard, so 27,000/2022, does make reference to a similar concept, this idea of identifying controls based on protection-based controls, operational controls, response or responding and detection-based controls as well. And it's a good approach to take. Personally, I really like it because it can really help structure and determine what controls are best for these scenarios, and particularly if you're having trouble trying to work out where do we start. So we are seeing other standards bodies adopt a similar concept, but I think NIST have had this for quite some time, and they've certainly had they've embedded it well in the way they get across controls.
Yeah, it seems appropriate for identifying which controls are best suited for suppliers, I think, using this type of approach. So it's really good to see.
Absolutely. I have a very short comparison just to show you how in-depth NIST can go. To have some very, very typical controls on the right-hand side, from access control and configuration management, managing inventory of systems and system components and data backup, and development as well. So development processes, so for software application development and the full development life cycle as well. On the left side, we can see where there's direct mapping to ISO 27001. I believe these controls are actually the 2013, not the 2022 control numbers. Apologies there. What's interesting to see is if we take a subject like A14 in ISO that covers a lot of depth around developing system development life cycles, principles of secure development and testing. And this captures these controls very well as well, and goes into the same level of depth. But then they also cover training specifically for developers and some of the nuanced skill sets that developers need. They also cover requirements for when you need to do customized developments outside of the standard process. And these are the areas that ISO, for example, to take that standard, do not cover. I think we covered a few other areas earlier around system architecture, the use of decoys, the use of honeypots and other technical components. And again, this just highlights that NIST takes many common subject areas such as access or system development or system building and integration, and greatly expands them. Some cases to a very technical nature and very technical need, others just providing a wider clarification on the subject area. Again, I think largely this comes from more of the historical side, where it was the businesses, the agencies who it's designed for. This hopefully just gives a short introduction into how it can take common topics, but also can go one step further and cover completely different areas or in a lot more depth as well.
Yeah, it's good stuff. I think which segues quite nicely onto this, because it's really emphasizing the need to address the scope of your assessment. For example, those controls we just went through, although they were very detailed, I guess they could be very occasional scenarios where they are relevant. It's just making sure that we only include them when they're relevant to improve on those efficiencies we discussed earlier.
Exactly.
Which is why that monitoring piece you mentioned also comes into play quite a bit, where we're using profiling and tiering exercises that we're seeing clients use much more often these days to identify who a vendor is, what service they're providing, and how critical they are to your operations and your business as a whole. And there's some real simple questions you can use to identify that, like a basic framework that's standardized, so you can identify tiering or criticality of vendors really easily. Understanding what the impact would be if that vendor was to fail in the performance or delivery of a service to you. And they may span across things like operational aspect or the risk of losing data, for example. And we can use some basic thresholds to provide some quite good detailing on which type of tier a particular vendor should fall into. And using that information, we could then choose to include certain question sets or more detailed question sets for those most critical vendors, which is going to be, something that gives you that additional level of assurance that you might feel you need in those scenarios. The other topic that's quite interesting here is looking at service-specific question sort of layers. So you may start off with your basic core control layer, and then based on the service they're providing, we might choose to include these other modules, if you like. So using that example a second ago, where we had the development example brought up on the screen, we may only need to include those development questions where the service includes in-house development, for example, or if we know they're interacting with personal data or sensitive data on our behalf, we might choose to include some more focused data security questions. And things like business continuity and disaster recovery may be more important for hosting providers. Those types of logic that we can apply to our question sets based on our profiling and tiering exercises can then make this process more efficient, because we're choosing selective content that fits the profile of a vendor. And that's why that exercise could be hugely valuable, making sure we keep in tune with our vendor, making sure we're collecting attributes on a regular basis that might impact how we assess the vendor and even remediate a vendor could be really valuable. One other point to note here as well is performing these profiling and tiering exercises is actually really useful for maintaining the relationship, making sure we're kept up to date with who we should be speaking to at the vendor side, and making sure that year on year, some of the impacts to our business haven't changed. There's some really useful exercises we can gain from a short questionnaire or short engagement with a vendor to understand some of these key attributes.
Absolutely, completely agree. And yeah, all this does is help strengthen that relationship, doesn't it? And particularly around, on both sides, making the experience with the vendor a pleasurable one in terms of making sure we're not overloading them with questions, with asks that are just irrelevant to them as a business. Also making sure when we do get back actions, risks, activities, that they're telling us what we want to know about that organization, and it's not as I think a term we used earlier, just noise and unwarranted information, or sometimes non-risk that's not relevant as a business, and it can skew perhaps the perception of that organization if we haven't done that due diligence correctly.
Yep.
So taking a step back, we've had a look at NIST, focused on NIST 853, this very in-depth, very detailed cybersecurity control assessment. We identified that there's a wider variety of standard frameworks out there that can help complement 853, such as the CSF. And so, of course, first key aspect is really that identification of your TPRM requirements, those minimum controls and best practices that you alluded to, Joe, in terms of that profiling and tiering and understanding. Are there certain standards that we want to pay attention to, such as ISO or SOC 2 or other regulations and best practice frameworks? Then building, if you haven't done already, that formal TPRM standards such as 800.161 that has the full end-to-end life cycle of supply chain risk management is always a good place to start. And building and continually reviewing and updating that profiling and tiering approach. And then when we have that process in place, then working with the standards, using this CSF in collaboration with 853 to create that baseline of controls. So here are, say, 100 controls or 50 controls that we need to look at. Then they may be streamlined based on that profiling and tiering. So we're not asking development questions from a non-development vendor, for example, and designing that NIST assessment based on those controls and where we want to focus on mapped best practices, such as 27K and beyond.
Yeah.
And then that continual post. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, and would you say a good place to start if you're sort of unsure about which controls to select, or even which standard or framework should be leveraged, would be to use that sort of hybrid approach, or at least compare some of the standards and frameworks and see, what their purpose is. Is it for a particular regulation? Do they include controls that are heavier in some areas that might be more relevant to you? Or should we look at these standards and frameworks and actually, as I said, really create a bit of a hybrid approach of leveraging the experience of all of them together to be able to.
I've always liked the hybrid approach. I mean, you can look at these things in isolation, of course, but there's so much commonality, and there's so much there's so much benefit to taking a standard, but then building off it all the additional best practice frameworks. So you really can get the best of multiple worlds in terms of having a governance structure, a risk structure, having technical control that goes to the level that, say, NIST can provide you versus the level that ISO or other frameworks can provide as well. So there's a lot of merit in using a structured framework and then building off it those standards, regulations, and other guideline practices as well.
Really helpful. Thanks, Tom.
And generally, we're finding that as well, that there are more companies adopting to this concept of this hybrid approach as well. Are there any final closing comments for yourself, Joe?
Nothing from me. As I was saying, I'm really focused on process here. So, I think the really valuable exercise here is taking a selection of controls that are meaningful to give you the output you need to make your program as efficient as possible, and not sort of blindly asking questions or assessing controls that you're not going to be following up on or getting meaningful data from. It's quite common that we see clients or programs started or even midway through their programs, and you see sort of pools of data that aren't being leveraged or put to good use because that information isn't currently valuable to them. Yes. So I would say that yes, it's great to start with a standard or framework that's something referenceable and you've got some justification for why these controls are there, but certainly bear in mind this tuning and this ability to match your sort of tuning activity to the profile of your organization and the types of third parties you're interacting with.
Absolutely. Before we continue, I'd just like to pause there, and I believe Scott, there's a few pieces you would like to cover.
Yes, please. I will share my screen now really quickly, just have one slide to cover with you. Let's see here. Quick check, Thomas, can you see my screen?
I can.
Awesome. Folks, I'll dispense with the usual prevalent overview because we're nearing the top of the hour, and I do want to make sure we have time for questions based on Tom and Joe's great presentation here. I do want to call everybody's attention to a couple of compliance checklists that we have published on the Prevalent website. One in particular directly related to today's topic. We've got the top 15 NIST third-party risk management and supply chain risk management controls. What we've done is we've scoured through several of the NIST requirements. You saw a lot of them today, 853, 161, 171, and others, and pulled out some of the most salient controls that you should use to build your program around, and or that you can use to kind of assess the key controls for your third-party vendors and suppliers. We'll include a link to that in the follow-up email with the recording and the presentation from today's session, but I do encourage you to take a look at that. That will help you kind of simplify and distill down, what the most important pieces of NIST are to pay attention to in your environment. So that's all I wanted to share. I'm going to kind of pitch back over to Ashley. Ashley, we can talk about any questions that are asked.
Thanks, Scott. I know we're coming up at the top of the hour here, so we won't have time, unfortunately, to get through all of these questions, but I do have one that came in who asked, you can't possibly ask all the questions on the 950 plus controls, but if you leave out an important one that comes to hunt in the future, how can you avoid that efficiency versus eventually?
I probably can grab this one, Tom, and you can add to it. I think this is where the benefit of that profiling exercise comes in and plays a huge role. We shouldn't be omitting questions that we could later rely on if there's an element of potential risk or exposure based on that control. So if we understand that a particular supplier is critical and needs a deeper level of assessment, then that's the type of assessment that, you know, should be fitting for that particular vendor. Tom, what are your thoughts?
I completely agree. It sort of underlines the importance of conducting a very in-depth risk assessment as much as practical, and aligning that with that profile, because the more you understand about the vendor, about what they're doing, it will make it so much easier to understand what are the controls or what are the risk areas that we're more concerned about, that we need to then focus on based on these type of controls.
Thanks, guys. And one last question here before we wrap things up. Do you have any recommendations for being able to calculate score based on written responses received from vendors on their assessments, or is this usually done in accordance to an organization's defined risk tolerance?
Yes, so that's an interesting question. So I always champion it's important to make sure that when you're looking at scores and saying, how do we determine whether this is let's say a critical or 25 versus a low or a medium and everything in between. Firstly, yes, it should come off the back of an organization's risk appetite and risk tolerance. Under what condition would you be happy to say we accept that risk if it were to occur? How detrimental is it going to be to our own operations, our brand, reputation, and some of those areas? So it's important to understand the impact areas first, I think. Following on from that, that should then make it slightly easier to work out if we know these are our top critical risks, because this is going to give us the largest damage. We can then do I always like the ISO version of impact over likelihood and that traditional risk scoring process. But I think, if it goes hand in hand, or it should go hand in hand with your risk appetite and criteria for risk acceptance. Would you agree, Joe?
Yeah, certainly. I think as much as we can steer away from the free text style of responses, the better. We have quite binary sets of control requirements mapped to controls in standards. So I would always suggest that the more we can map to those, the more efficient our process becomes, because it becomes more of a binary exercise of whether things are or are not in place. And it's easier to score that way as well. And of course, it's easier to work on remediation with that type of information as well. If they're missing 1 out of 3 control requirements, it's that one that we can grab onto very quickly and engage with the vendor about.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Scott, Thomas, Joe, and everyone for all of your questions. They gave us some great information to take in today. So I hope to see all of you either in your inbox or at a future private webinar. Cheers, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks,
everyone. Bye.